All right, now, we're not having worship this morning, and it turns out that it's a good thing, because when I started preparing for Acts chapter 6, it hit me that I needed to do a history lesson. And so we're going to do two 20-minute segments. So I'm going to do a history lesson, then we're going to take a break, and then I'm going to do the teaching part. And I think you'll see the relevance after we get started. So for starters, I want to read chapter 6, verse 1 in Acts. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, the Hellenists murmured against the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. That's all the verse I'm going to read to start out. And then I'm going to tell. What happens is some of the widows are not being cared for. You remember, they're all there after the day of Pentecost. They got tons of people there that weren't expecting to stay. I'm not sure why widows would come, but widows are there. And so people, remember from last week, they're selling their properties. They're trying to help provide for the needs of all these Jews from all over the Greco-Roman world. And so these widows are getting daily visits of food, mainly food and drink, food, water, wine, whatever it is they needed, and taken care of. And so apparently some of them were being neglected. Well, the disciples called the leadership together and said, look, find 7 men. Find some men who are qualified, who will take care of this problem, so that something like this will never happen again. So they find these men, they bring them to the apostles, they lay their hands on them, they pray for them. And the next verse, verse 7 reads, and the word of God increased, and the number of disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem. So, I'm about to whip through 700 years of history in what I think is a 15-minute time frame. This one verse, Acts 6:1, I have read this for 25 years, probably 20 times. I taught through the book of Acts at least twice in my pastoral ministry before going to do my PhD work. And I had no clue about everything I'm about to share with you in 15 minutes. A lot of this comes from the lectures I would do in my Old Testament classes in university. But it's a condensed version, so I'm going to fly. But it's so critical, this one verse, if we want to understand the book of Acts, and I believe the Apostle Paul and the entirety of the New Testament, you've got to understand the historical nature of what Luke just told us. He dropped a bomb on his readers, but they knew the bomb. We don't know the bomb. Okay? So a lot of us are familiar with the history of Israel. David, he establishes Israel, he establishes the borders, he beats back the Philistines, wants to build a temple, and God says, no, you've shed too much blood. Your son can build the temple. So Solomon builds the temple. He expands the governmental agencies under heavy taxation, builds a massive army, builds a bunch of governmental buildings for himself. And when he dies, his 2 sons fight over how they're going to lead Israel from that point. One of them wanted to continue in Solomon's, with the same ideas that Solomon had, heavy taxation. The other one said, no, we can't do that. We need to move away from this. We're killing the people. They fought over it and they divided the kingdom. So it becomes what we know of in Old Testament history as the divided kingdoms. You have the kingdom of Israel in the north, 10 tribes in the north. And then you have the southern kingdom of Judah in the south, which consisted of the tribe of Judah. I didn't look this up, but I think Benjamin and the Levites, because the Levites had to be around the temple. Now, it's during this time frame as well that we have a bunch of the prophets that we know of in the Old Testament. They operate during this period. The northern kingdom of Israel didn't have a temple. So how are they going to do animal sacrifices? Well, the first brilliant idea they had was, we'll build our own altar. We'll build our own altar and our own temple. And the prophets are going nuts. You can't do this. This is not proper worship of Yahweh. If you persist in this, judgment will come. And indeed, in 722, the Assyrian Empire grows and comes and gobbles up the northern kingdom of Israel. They carry the Jews back with them to Assyria, which was normal in the ancient world when you captured another kingdom in order to dilute their culture and to dilute their resistance to the new kingdom. They would take them into exile and they would transplant them all around their empire to break them apart. Okay? Kind of like what we did to the slaves, the Africans, when we brought them here. So what happened is these 10 tribes of Israel assimilated with all the culture around them, and they slowly faded away. They intermarried and slowly faded away. And what do we call them now? The 10 lost tribes of Israel. We literally have no historical record of what happened to them other than they're gone. And we have no idea how other than the overview I just gave you. Excuse me. A mere 120 years later, in the 590s, the southern kingdom of Judah is overrun by the Babylonian Empire. And the same thing happens. They cart the Jews off to Babylon for what we call the Babylonian captivity. It lasted for a couple hundred years. They they heavily damaged the temple, set it on fire. So the Jews lived in the Babylonian exile for a couple hundred years until the Persians took over. And then the Persians actually opened the door for them to send small groups of Jews back to rehabilitate their land. And of course, the primary thing they wanted to do was rebuild the temple and reestablish animal sacrifices the way it's supposed to be done in the laws of Moses. That is the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. In 322 BC, Alexander the Great finishes the overrunning of all of Asia Minor, including all the way down to Egypt. I mean, he basically took over the known world at the time. And so Josephus, the Jewish historian and contemporary of Jesus, records an interesting story that Alexander the Great, when he was coming through Palestine, he met the high priest of Israel outside the city gates. And he basically said, I've heard of your God, and we're not going to overrun your people. I'm interested in who you are. And according to Josephus, he goes into the temple, he offers sacrifices, and he promises the high priest, I will leave you alone. You can have self-determination and run your own government. Just pray for me and for your God to look after me. It's a very interesting story. What we know is that Alexander the Great was actually tutored by Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher. In Aristotle's work called Meteorology, he's discussing the wonders of the world. And one of the wonders of the world he mentions is he talks about in Palestine there's a sea that men can tie someone up and throw them into the water and they won't drown, they'll float. Well, we all know what that is. That's the Dead Sea. So we know that we're almost positive that Alexander the Great, through Aristotle, has heard stories about Israel. No doubt. He probably heard about King David and his mighty exploits and killing a giant. So there was something going on that made Alexander not want to overrun this new kingdom of Judah trying to establish Israel again. However, Alexander pushes the Greek language on all of his empire. It's his way of diluting culture and diluting resistance. If everyone speaks a different language, we take away your native tongue, it will make an assimilation more easy. Now, if Joy could put it up here. So the Greek word that we translate Greek is Helenikos. And Helenikos is actually the word that Luke uses in Acts 6:1, the Hellenists. These were Greek-speaking Jews. We talked about they got carried into Assyria and they intermarried. Now, that group disappeared, but the same thing with the Jews who wander away from exile in Babylon and during the time of Alexander the Great, Jews all around the Greco-Roman world are speaking Greek. And so when Luke talks about the Hellenists, This is what he's talking about. For about 300 years, the Jews assimilate themselves if they don't live in Palestine. And typically it was only in Jerusalem that the Jews spoke Hebrew and read the Hebrew text. And they spoke Aramaic, a dialect of Hebrew. Other than that, Jews all around the world, all around the Asia Minor and the Greco-Roman world speak Greek. And they start dressing like Greeks. And they start reading Greek philosophy. And they're becoming further and further Hellenized, Greek-oriented. The difficulty is a Greek-speaking Jew face serious problems. How they're going to worship Yahweh. If they live in Persia, or they live in Rome, or they live in Egypt, how are they going to offer animal sacrifices to atone for their sins and the sins of all their family and their children? So that was a problem. Another problem they had was if they made their way on a pilgrimage, like on the day of Pentecost or to celebrate one of the festivals, they spent their whole time in the market buying the animals that were prescribed for the particular sacrifices that they had to make. And once they, figure out and they buy the animal, then they have to take it to the temple. Then they have to stand around with hundreds and hundreds of other people and wait to go up and present their offering or their animal to the priest, who will then kill it and pray over them and all that. They can't ask any questions because they don't speak Aramaic. I doubt anyone in the temple is going to respond to them in Greek anyway, because Greek is not the language you're supposed to be speaking in the temple in the house of God. Hebrew. Aramaic is what you're supposed to be speaking. They could go to the temple and hear the law of Moses, but they can't understand it because it's read in Hebrew. So they're typically only moderately wealthy Jews made the pilgrimages. So all the poor people, street people, fishermen, farmers, they can't do this. So what develops is this, we see three things develop to try to help the Greek-speaking Jews around the Greco-Roman world to worship Yahweh. One is they translate the Old Testament into Greek. We call it the Septuagint. And it took a span of 150 years to get all the books that are now in the Septuagint into that book, or into that collection. But it was a way that rabbis in Greek-speaking synagogues around the Roman world could read the law of Moses to their people and they could understand it. So that was one thing that developed. Second thing is they developed a spiritual view of animal sacrifices. Since you cannot get to Jerusalem and offer animal sacrifices, they had to figure out, what can we do to teach people that God still loves them and cares about them? So they developed a spiritual mindset according to like what Jeremiah preached, that a new day was coming when the law would be written on your heart. And so that was beginning to develop in this time period. And then thirdly, because you couldn't go to the temple as often, the temple became less important to the Greek-speaking Jews by necessity. They can't do it. So they begin to teach that, the presence of God doesn't only reside in the temple. You remember, that was the context. I want to build a house where the glory of God, the Shekinah, will dwell. So now they're developing this mindset that the presence of God is not only in the temple. If we meet in our Greek-speaking synagogue in Persia and we read the law of Moses and we pray to God, God will hear us and He will be with us. Let me check my time real fast. Holy cow, I got to move. Okay. Then you come to the age of the Maccabees. I want to read a text. Now Alexander the Great defeated Darius, king of the Persians. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. That's out of 1 Maccabees. So Alexander the Great is mentioned. 1 Maccabees is in the Apocrypha, a group of texts that Protestants rejected in the Reformation. Two or three major branches of Christianity still believe the Apocrypha is inspired by God. This happens to be my Anglican Bible with the Apocrypha. But I think it's interesting that Alexander the Great is mentioned in 1 Maccabees 1:1. And it lays the predicate for everything I've just told you. After Alexander died, Israel was caught between two opposing generals under Alexander. One was in the Seleucids in the Syrian Empire north of Israel. The other were Ptolemies and the empire that became the Egyptian empire to the south of Israel, and they were constantly struggling for who would dominate, and Israel was caught in the middle. During this period, the Syrian Empire gained prominence and attacked Israel once again and overthrew the temple and all of what was then the kingdom of Israel again. So I'm going to read one more text. From Syria, and this is verse 10 of 1 Maccabees, verses 10 through 14. From Syria came Antiochus Epiphanes. In those days lawless men came forth from Israel and misled many, saying, "Let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles round about us." So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom. And Antiochus demanded that they stop circumcising their sons and they stop trying to follow the law of Moses. And the Jews joined in this desire to be like the Gentiles. Now, I don't know if that brings in your mind, but this is Hellenization. So Antiochus is trying to force down the throats of the Israelis this Greek-oriented culture that had already impacted the Jews living all over the place, but now in Israel, in Jerusalem. In fact, Antiochus went and offered a pig on the altar. And they called it the abomination that leads to desolation. Because Jesus refers to that, and we always think he's talking about the future. He's actually referring to something that happened 160 years before he lived, when Antiochus took over the temple and put a pig on the altar. Well, when that happens, this family that we call the Maccabees, they rise up in armed conflict, and they eventually beat off the Syrians and reestablish Israel. But you need to understand from everything I just told you, this is why Greek-speaking Jews, if you think about the Maccabean revolt, it's this resistance to being Hellenized. We do not want Greek culture. So now when we come to Acts 6:1 and Luke says we got these Greek-speaking Jews and they're not being cared for because the Hebrew Jews, the Hebrew widows are being cared for, but not the Greek-speaking Jews, you begin to realize there's this whole history that has happened. And now the early church has it thrown in their lap, probably not realizing that it would become such an issue. You know, one of the things the Hebrew-speaking Jews did to accommodate the Greek-speaking Jews, in Jerusalem, they built little synagogues and put signs on them. This synagogue is for the Greek speakers from Syria. This synagogue is for the Greek speakers from Egypt. I don't know about you, but when I hear that, it makes me think of water fountains and restaurants, for whites only. They did it under the guise of, we want you to have a place where you can hear the law of Moses when you come to Jerusalem. You know what it really was is we don't want you looking like a Greek in the temple. And we don't want you, when you can't understand Hebrew, God's language. So there you go. That brings us to the context that Luke gives us in Acts 6:1. All right. Thus ends our quick history lesson. Questions? Anybody want to ask or comments? Questions or comments about what you just heard? I know it was a ton. Anybody? No? Okay. Let's take a break, get a cookie, get some water, get some coffee, do whatever you need to do, and then we're going to talk about how this should apply to us. Okay?